नमस्कार मीरा.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.
So, shall we start? Okay. Thank you so much, dear and respected friend. Let's start today's session with an invocation of a song. So let me just share the screen.
Randhir, before you...
Thank you, dear and respected friend. Thank you so much for your kind attention. First of all, we offer our humble tribute to Mahatma Gandhi, a stalwart of peace, harmony, and non-violence. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Raffles University, SOHSS Circle of Creative Co-Learning, Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, and Rage Global Foundation. I welcome you from the bottom of my heart to this symposium. Dear and respected friend, this symposium is being co-nurtured by Raffles University and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. The topic of today's symposium is Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., Martyrdom, World Emancipation and Alternative Planetary Future. It is a movement of extreme pleasure to welcome the guests who are virtually present here to attend this symposium. I would like to invite and welcome Professor dear and respected friend, kindly mute yourself so that we can avoid disruption. Yes. So I would like to welcome Professor Soltes from Georgetown University, Washington, DC, USA. He will be delivering his talk on the very topic, the Oblique Triangle of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Buber, and Martin Luther King, Satyagraha, Dialogue, Emancipation, and Martyrdom. I would like to welcome Dr. Christian Bartolf from Gandhi Information Center, Berlin, Germany. Welcome, Doctor, from all the way from Germany. And he will be talking on the very topic, Voices of Conscience, Gandhi and King as Emancipators. I would like to welcome Professor Douglas Allen from University of Maine, Orono, USA. I would like to welcome Professor Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, and all the distinguished participants, both on Zoom platform and Facebook platform. Let me give a kind of brief introduction of SOHSS Chakra. SOHSS Chakra is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chittaranjan Das, a creative thinker from Odisha, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their life's vision, sadhana, and a struggle for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. We are now nurturing this in collaboration with the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University and Rage Global Foundation, USA. Today is a very special day, and I'm going to start today's session with a cartoon. So let me just share the screen. Thank you. So, very important statement made by Martin Luther King. The odd thing about assassination, Dr. King, that they think they have killed you, and ideas can never be killed. Remembering Mahatma Gandhi on his 74th death anniversary, Martin Luther King Jr. said, if humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted, inspired by vision of humanity, evolving towards a world of peace, justice, and harmony. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, from whom we took such great inspiration. Their struggle for equality, freedom, and justice through non-violence and love of humanity to the accomplishment of their respective goals are remarkable. Their non-violence philosophy was founded in their belief and trust in the human goodness. Today, we need to discuss Gandhi's ideas that we need so badly. I think so urgent we need idea and emotion of Gandhi in a majoritarian collective conscience if we want to establish a society which is based on peace and harmony. And that is very important thing for the emancipation of the whole humanity. Today is the day of not only just remember Mahatma Gandhi, but also his contribution of his idea. So with this brief introduction, I would like to invite Professor Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you, dear Randhir. Sat Sri Akal, Salam, Salam Alaikum, Sat Sri Akal to all friends co-present, Professor Orige Soltes, Professor Douglas Allen, Dr. Christian Bartolf, Professor John Clemmer, Sandhya Appa, Minati, Professor Mira Chakrabarti, and all enthusiastic co-travelers with Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and also with Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas. And I see Dr. Julius Roybke also being co-present. It is our journey together with Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., but also with Buber. And Ori would pass this journey with Buber. Also has been a deep co-traveler with Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and also Emmanuel Levinas and Martin Buber. So I wish to initiate, or let me say, I wish to offer a few thoughts in this journey of go thinking. Let me take a moment to share the screen, please. Martyrdom, Emancipation, and World Transformations, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Alternative Planetary Futures. And we begin with this thought from Martin Luther King Jr., who says, the blood seed of the tabernacle of freedom. And he goes on to say, so I said to you, my friends, that even though we say of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. Because with all the challenges of violence today, the journey is that how do we really have a dream? It is a dream deeply rooted in American dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And of course, King would say, all men, women, children, and also all plants also are created equal. So therefore, the dream of equality and dignity today, as it is rooted in American dream, it is also rooted in Indian dream, Chinese dream, and the dream of humanity. And that dream of humanity also is a dream of overcoming human-centeredness and overcoming anthropocentrism. And how King has been deeply influenced by Gandhi. He says, I was particularly moved by the salt march to the sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of Satyagraha profoundly became significant to me. And January 30, today, and as we talk about martyrdom, I also wish to invite us what can be called as a new art of martyrdom. Of course, we are known about martyrs of war. And today, There are many people who would like to call themselves martyred by killing others. But the real challenge of being a martyr is the whole path of loving self-sacrifice and not sacrificing others for oneself or one's creed and religion, and fearlessness. And we have to understand how the journey and what can be called as tapasya of loving fearlessness in both Gandhi and King. And that loving fearlessness emerged with faith in God and with God. And we know how in Gandhi's life, it is the faith in God which created that loving fearlessness. But that faith in God also was accompanied by faith with fellow human beings. And similarly, in King's life, I remember that self-narration of Martin Luther King Jr., which I read in a winter day in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And where King is saying, Martin Luther is saying that when he was in Alabama, in the middle of the night, he received a call. And the call was that please leave this place, otherwise tomorrow there will be problem for you. And Martin Luther King at that moment, he just meditates. Whom I'm going to call? My dear wife with children, they are asleep. What I am going to do by calling my old father in Atlanta? And at that moment, he realized that I also have to surrender myself to God. And it was a moment of realization for him. So that brings us to the dimension of faith, faith and history. Professor Musirul Hasan, a great historian of India, has written a book called Faith and History, and we're working on Gandhi's. But also with Martin Luther King, we can also bring dimension of faith and history, and how both King and Gandhi tried to create a beloved community, and that non-violence was very different from the known routines of pacifism, because they really linked non-violence to struggle for peace, justice, and solidarity. Another very important moment in King's life, and that he tells that with the support of the American president, for example, Lyndon Johnson, who took extra mile steps to write the creed, about non-discrimination, but still King wanted to critique the American involvement with Vietnam War. So he was not within the comfort zone. And that was a radical moment in his life. And then that led also to another struggle. He realized that the struggle for racial justice must be linked to
Sir, I think you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
You're muted, Ananta.
So, okay, I'll just come 1 minute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I hope you could hear my submission about loving fearlessness and anti-war movement. And very quickly, I would like to move on. That this whole idea of martyrdom then, J.P.S. Buber, who also is a deep, co-traveler with Gandhi, as well as he has reflected on the tradition of martyrdom in Islam, as well as in Sikhism. He tells us how martyrdom is the foundation of civil society. And he links that not only to the Islamic tradition and the Sikh Jewish, but all the way back to the Sophocles drama, Antigone, the play Antigone, where Antigone, according to Buber, is the first martyr of humanity. And Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, and that act of martyrdom is built across big society with its own journey of immanence and transcendence. To this, we have to think about everyday acts and meditations of martyrdom, nurtured by fearlessness, martyrdom as a journey with nirvana and samsara. Gandhi gives a new interpretation of nirvana, martyrdom and creative love, overcoming ego-centeredness towards a new ecology of relation, and martyrdom and dialogue, because how dialogical act to be part of dialogue as it involves overcoming one's ego is also a little act of martyrdom. So I would like to suggest little martyrdom and little and big dialogues of life. So martyrdom and death and immortality, because the cartoon suggests that, oh, you are mistaken, that you have killed me, but you have not really killed me. It brings the question of immortality and mortality. And we can link it to another challenge. For example, Amartya Sen, he starts his book, Development and Freedom, with recounting the dialogue between Yajnavalkya and Maitreya. When Maitreya is asking Yajnavalkya, oh Yajnavalkya, you are leaving me here to milk the cows, but I would milk the cows all day, but would I gain immortality? And Yajnavalkya is saying, no, my dear, you are not going to get immortality. Amartya Sen interprets in this way that how do we really get immortality? He brings by saying that, okay, look at child mortality, for example, malnutrition. Now, if we can give nutritious food to children, then their life would be enhanced. So the point is that if we link this whole idea of martyrdom in this way to overcoming death and creating little acts of immortality. If a child who is going to die in 100 days, if he is going to be able to live, say, 50 years, it is a little act of immortality. That requires a different kind of public policy. And Sen, Amartya Sen, in his recent autobiography, very moving autobiography, A Home in the World, he talks about two things. One is the known tradition of contractarianism, how there is a need to bring unconditional love and care. He builds some Buddha here to contractarian tradition, including contractarian traditions of John Locke and John Raffles. And then he tells that how the need for cooperation, persuasion, and listening. And in the video we saw Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he created a field of persuasion and a rhetoric of persuasion in a very difficult moment. Gandhi also did that. Martin Luther King also did that. So how do we link our little everyday act of martyrdom to these activities of cooperation, persuasion, and listening? And then very quickly we can bring Savitri also here, Sri Aurobindo's epic Savitri, where Savitri is also struggling with mortality and trying to revive Satyavan here, and how the little act of martyrdom today in terms of creation of life also can draw inspiration from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. And we can remember here what Sri Aurobindo has spoken on 4 February 1948 on Gandhi's assassination. He says, I would have preferred silence in the face of these circumstances that surround us. For any words we can find fall flat amid such happenings. This much, however, I would say, that the light which led us to freedom, though not yet to unity, still burns and will burn on till it conquers. And Aurobindo is saying, I am not reading the whole paragraph, that the life that brought us freedom also would lead us unity. So in terms of alternative planetary future, unity in that evolving sense is for us. And from and quickly, let me see. I would like to present you a point, and here, in terms of the alternative planetary future, I wish to bring this thought to Sudha, who is saying the contemporary crisis is a crisis of civilization or civilization model of Western modernity. So when the Western capitalist modernity has really been a graveyard, so how we create new lives? I wish to suggest that out of many practices that challenged before us to one the practice of listening, and how do we cultivate a courage path of listening. And I think the Buberian dialogue also path of listening. And this poem, Apostles of Years, Apostasy, Apostle of Fear. Where are the apostles of year marching in the name of Kingdom of God, Rama Rajya, Kingdom of Rama, banishing Sita and killing Sambuka, on the way sacrificing innocents as lambs? Where are your tears? Where are our ears? So today, on this day with Gandhi and Martin Luther King, the question before us, where are our tears and where are our ears? So with this offering, so it is a joy for me to welcome and invite Professor Orige Soltes. I wish to humbly share that Professor Soltes has been so kind and generous to be with us as always. And he has a prior commitment. So he would be with us maybe for another 25 to 30 minutes, given our communication. So I invite Professor Soltes, and after Professor Soltes speaks for 20 to 25 minutes, we'll have a quick dialogue with him, and then we'll move on to listen to Dr. Bartolf and Professor Allen and our mutual conversation. So Ori, please.
Thank you, Ananta, and I apologize in advance, but no, I thought I would be starting closer to 8 o'clock. It's now almost 8:30, and I had a prior commitment, which I pushed back. I can't push back further. So I will be even briefer than Ananta has suggested, and I may not be able to stay for a conversation, so you'll have to converse behind my back without me, which is okay. My brief topic is to consider Gandhi, Buber, and King as a kind of oblique triangle, for which the starting point, of course, is both chronologically and conceptually Gandhi and his idea of Satyagraha, with which we are all familiar, and about which the first thing I would say is to emphasize, while it has an overlap and a connection to a concept like ahimsa or nonviolence, the most important and most essential distinction comes from the terms themselves. Both the words ahimsa and nonviolence have negativizers. They are non-X, whereas Satyagraha has truth as its center and is a positive, not a negative. Its goal, of course, is to change a situation in which one is oppressed, but without ever forgetting that your oppressor, like you, is a besouled being, and therefore, in pursuit of truth, one, to quote Gandhi, keeps the channels, or rather the channels of communication are kept open, so that in a sense, the goal of Satyagraha is not only to achieve a kind of liberation and a kind of equilibrium and a cessation of oppression, but to do so by way of an instrument that includes front and foremost dialogue that can only be had between individuals or groups who have some recognition of their common humanity, of their common possessing of a soul. And so the intention of Satyagraha, whether in South Africa or subsequently in India, is to have a kind of dialogue between the Indians on the one hand, or in South Africa, both Indians and indigenous people of color, and the British and others, the Boers, on the other hand. And of course, the idea of dialogue is front and center for the work that in 1923 was first written by Martin Buber, who was a great admirer of Gandhi. And in his concept of dialogue, he in fact makes a distinction between two ways of being in the world. One way is what he calls I thou or I you, parenthesis, as Christian will tell you. In German, you have different ways of saying you, as we do not in contemporary English. In older English, we could distinguish you from thou. And the idea of translating ich, du as I, thou is to suggest a more informal way of addressing the other. Whereas I think actually in contemporary English, if we use thou, we think of it as more formal. So it's a kind of language paradox. But here's the point. I, thou is to be in a relationship with someone else. I, it is the alternative way of being in the world, and that's to experience someone else. I thou is a condition in which you recognize the I-ness of the thou with which one is in relationship. I, it, you don't, because it's all about myself. Everything is for my purposes. So I, thou, I, it, and Buber says, we don't all the time have I, thou, we go back and forth, but the goal, of course, is to engage with reality as far as possible in an I, thou way of being. And he goes on to say, you know, there are kind of three levels upon which one can do this. There's the human-human relationship, and the primary medium then is language. But you can also have an I, thou relationship with other elements of nature, as Ananta was referring in the very beginning, the first quote that he offered in his comments, that with dogs and cats, with trees and rocks, one can have a relationship, but it's not going to be verbal in the same way that it will with humans. And furthermore, Buber goes on to say, one can have an I-thou relationship with God. And his proposal for how that is possible, because he is speaking from the perspective largely of existentialism, which denies the very existence of God, but also possesses as a central idea that it inherited from pre-existentialist Western thinkers like Immanuel Kant and George Friedrich Hegel, the idea of the will. With existentialism, the will becomes the absolute free will to be what I will be because there's no metaphysical superstructure to interfere with me. Well, Buber takes that, turns it on its head and says, you can use the will to bring God to the table of relationship. If you can, by an act of will, suspend for a moment your disbelief in God's being, God will be there. So his sense of I, thou is that it can be on all kinds of fronts. And the ultimate front that he wants to include is the front of divine human relations. On a path parallel to Gandhi's understanding within Satyagraha, not only that it is a goal of dialogue, but a goal of dialogue because it acknowledges the presence of God in all of us. So we arrive at a rather interesting turn of events when Nazi Germany has ramped up its program from the time Hitler comes to power in 1933 to the time of Kristallnacht on November 9th, 10th, 1938, its program against the Jews. And Gandhi ends up writing about the Jews in Germany and also the Jews in Palestine. And Buber himself at that point has moved to Palestine. He's fled what is happening in Germany to something positive. And Gandhi comments quite legitimately on the Jewish friends that he has. And he says, you know, simple Satyagraha would work. And now I quote Gandhi, the Jews of Germany offering Satyagraha would do so under infinitely better auspices than the Indians of South Africa. He goes on to suggest that there is no particularly legitimate reason for the Jews to seek Palestine as a place to go in leaving Germany or anywhere else, that it belongs to, the term that he uses is the Arabs. I say that the term that he uses because most people do, and it's a technical kind of error, since there were Jews in the Arab going back to and beyond the time of Muhammad. So there are Jewish Arabs. So it's a false dichotomy, but I'll accept it just because it's common parlance. So Gandhi's support for the non-Jewish presence in Palestine and non-support of the Jewish presence, particularly that coming from Europe, in particular from Germany, has been connected by some because remember that at this time he is seeking to develop an independent kind of India, and he's looking for a pluralistic India that will involve Hindus and Muslims and not two separate states, post-colonial British India. And so he's seeking support from the Khalifat movement, which was a Muslim movement seeking for the support of the British to maintain the Ottoman Sultan. This is in the early 20s after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire politically was no longer, but there was emerging a post-Ottoman state of Turkey, but the Caliphate movement wanted the Ottoman Sultan to continue to be a spiritual leader within the Muslim world. And eventually that idea would die out, but that's in part another story. The issue here is Gandhi's writing to the Jews. There were in particular 2 articles in the publication that he edited. So they were public, open letters, as it were. And Buber responded eventually, only gradually. This was 1938 and 1939. So right before and right after Kristallnacht, he responded in great distress because he was such a great admirer of Gandhi. And he says, what you're saying doesn't make sense, and lays out, as one can fairly easily, a kind of parallel schema between the situation of the Indians in South Africa or in India while the Brits were there, and the situation of the Jews once the Nazis arrived into Germany after 1933, with, as I said, a progression and succession of anti-Jewish legislation that culminated in the violence of Kristallnacht of November 9th, 10th of 1938. In both situations, in Buberian terms, the British and the Indians and the Germans and the Jews, where we have I-it. No, neither of those situations is per se I-thou, because I-thou implies to repeat an even playing ground in which I recognize your I, and I have a relationship with you rather than I seeing you as an it that I experience. Certainly the British would not be accused of having had an overly I-thou relationship with the Indians whom they had governed for so long, but for so long they had had a relationship of sorts with them, the point and purpose of which was to maintain the colonial empire, of which India was such an important part, just as South Africa was an important part. The British interest in the Middle East that was part of what led to World War I was precisely because the Germans had gotten a place within the Middle East through the relationship between the Kaiser and the Sultan by the end of the 1880s, the beginning of the 1890s, and that threatened the British colonial empire that was envisioned as something to extend from India through the Middle East all the way down through East into South Africa. I mean, there were other issues as well. But the point is, the Indians had a long relationship with the Brits, in which the British oppressed, but certainly had no desire to exterminate the Indians. By contrast, the Jews in Germany were facing in the Nazi machine a recently arrived at form of administration that on the one hand drew from a roughly speaking 18 or 1900 year hatred of the Jews, and on the other hand reached a point where its intention was not colonialism, its intention was not enslavement, its intention was not subordination, its intention was extermination. So with the Nazi intent to exterminate the Jews, the notion of dialogue from the Jewish side, or Satyagraha from the Jewish side to the Nazi side, from Buber's perspective, could not be farther from how reality really was, to be intentionally redundant. And he comments, in fact, that he had seen before he left Germany many cases of the noble spirit of Jews of Satyagraha against the German Christian majority. But by the time of Kristallnacht, it's very clear that that's not going to work. One of Gandhi's developed instruments, which was so successful, was fasting, as you all know. But to imagine the Jews as engaging in a fast has a certain absurdity to it, because of course in the camps they were being starved to death, slowly but certainly. And I recommend to your attention Elie Wiesel's memoir Night, in which he talks about the debate among the Jews when it came to the Day of Atonement, where you were expected to fast for 25 hours, whether they should be, since they're fasting all the time anyway. So should they simply hasten their deaths by acceding to this? And Buber brings up as well the situation in which we're talking about Jews scattered, and we're talking about Indians, on the other hand, even in South Africa, 150,000 of them. And with an India with, at that point, 200 million Indians. So he says these are very different situations. And with respect to Gandhi's comments about the Jews in Palestine and the Muslim Christian population there, where Gandhi said the Jews should become accustomed to leaving home. Buber says, did you say that to the Indians? And being dispersed in an absolute way, as opposed to a relative way, ultimately becomes dismemberment. Buber, moreover, pointed out in his open letter to Gandhi that he had, in fact, been a champion and remained a champion, and to his dying day continued to be a champion of the idea of one state that would be shared among Jews, Christians, and Muslims within Palestine, as opposed to separating into two or more states. And that from the time the British were in charge there in 1917, that's what he had advocated. Well, what's interesting, among other things, is it seems that Gandhi had very little actual understanding at the time of his writing as to what was happening in Germany, or for that matter, of what the conditions were in Palestine. And he changed his perspective after the failure of the Caliphate, after he gained a better sense of the Jewish situation in both Germany and Palestine. He changed his perspective. Bichu Parech, who wrote a short bio of Gandhi, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, wrote that Gandhi maintained that suffering love can, and then he quotes Gandhi, melt even the stoniest hearts, end of the quote of Gandhi. But Parech's quote goes on to say, but he knew that reality was quite different. Economic boycott, non-payment of taxes, non-cooperation, hartal, or ceasing to work, doesn't in all circumstances succeed. And it is not Parech, but it was Buber who pointed out that, of course, Gandhi, who so admired the text of the Bhagavad Gita, seemed, in admiring it, to ignore the point that it makes, which is Arjuna, the prince, is very reluctant to go to war against what essentially are his friends, his neighbors, and members of his own family. And it is God itself, it is Krishna, who, as his charioteer, as you all know, says to Arjuna, first of all, as a kshatriya, as a warrior, as part of that caste, that's what your job is. Second of all, you're doing this to reestablish the dharma, the order of things that your uncle has upset. And third of all, of course, this is the most important point, you're not really killing anyone whom you end up killing, because all you're doing is destroying the carapace, the body, that is a temporary home for the Atman, the soul, which is permanent. And by way of samsara, you don't know whether, in fact, you might not be assisting someone whom you believe you've killed to move on to the next stage in ongoing existence, ultimately even towards moksha and the condition of nirvana. So all of this brings us to Martin Luther King, who, like Buber, was an enormous admirer of Gandhi and encountered him posthumously. Buber was 19 years old when Gandhi was assassinated. But as he developed his own strategy for how to accomplish his goals, to raise up the colored underclasses, people of color, over and against the white overclasses that were so oppressive and suppressive and repressive, he understood the value of Satyagraha, but also understood it needed certain revisions. He was, after all, coming from a Christian perspective, Gandhi from a Hindu perspective. And as much as both of them were appreciative of diverse religious perspectives, as of course was Buber as well, yet the foundations were slightly different. So the metaphysics, you might say, were different. And more fundamentally, of course, the conditions of American democracy were different from the conditions of British colonialism, just as from Buber's perspective, either or both of those were different from the condition of the Jews in Nazi Germany and different from the situation that was developing in Palestine at that time. The goal for King was to be fully integrated into American society. It wasn't a goal to create a separate independent state which of course was the point, purpose, and goal of Gandhi's efforts. So different methods, therefore, of non-cooperation would have been necessary, different methods, different aspects of Satyagraha in the long run necessary. So where one ends up with this, and as I said, this is a very, very brief kind of overview, as it were, discussion, is we recognize on the one hand, the absolute universality of Satyagraha, how applicable it is across different contexts, situations, different peoples, different places, but requiring creative adaptation and development, including sometimes recognizing conditions where it doesn't really work. Satyagraha didn't work for Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Satyagraha works differently under different conditions of humans, God, and the interface between those two. And where for Buber, our goal is I, thou, and for Gandhi, our goal is to find the soul force instead of the brute force of people. These are ideals, and they are ideals for which we must always strive. But we must strive for those ideals, recognizing, well, first of all, that we can't always achieve them. Look at today's world, and it's very clear that at least that we have not. And that if we are to achieve them, we have to keep striving, but recognizing how adaptive we need to be. Footnote, epilogue, just because Ananta brought up Socrates. Socrates, who initiates in the Western tradition the idea of dialogue in the sense simply of discussion, has myriad discussions about myriad ideas with myriad individuals. And in none of those discussions does he end up at a definitive conclusion. He always ends up at what we call aporia, literally no passage, no way out, a non-conclusion conclusion, except the conclusion is that you have to continue to strive, you have to continue to think, you have to continue to discuss. The trouble comes when you think you know you've got it all figured out, and then you walk away from the ongoing process, which is necessary. So my oblique triangle in the end is an oblique rectangle that involves, you might say, four thinkers. Socrates being added to the pile, along with Gandhi, Buber, and of course, Martin Luther King. And I thank you all very much. And I apologize, I will be leaving in 4 minutes, Ananta. 4 minutes. I return the floor to you.
So, Toda Roba, Toda, dear Ori, and we are sorry that in our introduction, so we took a little time and we could not hear you that much, but it has been such a insightful journey with you and from you. But this rectangle includes all men.
This is true. That's point well taken. My discussion did, which is by no means to deny that we could expand the rectangle to many more angles. And of course, there are important women that we would include as well. Absolutely. And with King also, like without Coretta Scott King and Rosa Parks, and so therefore the nurturing feminine is a very co-present reality, but the concluding thought is so deep, that is in Socrates, that we do not know, I do not know, and therefore that is the seed of hope and the kind of absolute finality, and which is really the source of the extermination message. So we are deeply grateful to you, and even in your physical absence, we would dialogue with some of your thoughts and with our profound gratitude to you. Okay.
So we
thank you.
Thank you all very much. And again, I apologize for leaving. I was particularly eager to hear what Christian has to say and what Douglas has to say and what everybody else has to say. So ich bitte Entschuldigung, Christian. Bis zum nächsten Mal.
Wonderful. And you might read this book. I wrote a book about your topic, by the way.
Aha.
It's about the Buber Gandhi controversy It was 1998, and it would be a good basis for a talk, but next time.
Okay.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all very much.
So with this, vielen Dank aus. A warm welcome, please.
Yes, it's my floor now. Ananta, thank you for your invitation. Randhir, what a nice idea, what a nice concept to bring Gandhi and Dr. King together this day. For people coming from Germany like myself, particularly as a descendant of the Nazi victims and Nazi perpetrators, it is a very dark date, 30 of January, and you can call it a kind of coincidence, maybe it's not, that this was the date when Gandhi was killed. So, of course, I could add a lot to this discourse on fascism, violence, and non-violence. But I chose another topic for you today. It's referring to Gandhi and King, if you don't mind. So this might be interesting to shed some new information maybe for you about the background of Dr. King's references to Gandhi. And we should keep in mind, when listening to all what I will say during the next 20 minutes, that there have been many assassination attempts against Gandhi as well as King, and they failed. And I will refer to one of them because there was one assassination attempt against Dr. King, which was essential for his development. And you will soon listen to details about this. And it was in 1958, and it failed. So I would like to start with a very interesting bridge between Gandhi and King, with a text, a tribute, marking the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Gandhi, which appeared jointly in the Hindustan Times and Peace News. And in this tribute, King reveals Gandhi's profound influence on his thinking about social change. And that was on January 30, 1958. And King wrote the following. Remember, this was before the assassination I mentioned, and before the trip to India. So in Hindustan Times, you could read King's words, King's tribute. He wrote, Mahatma Gandhi has done more than any other person of history to reveal that social problems can be solved without resorting to primitive methods of violence. In this sense, he is more than a saint of India. He belongs, as they said of Abraham Lincoln, to the ages. In our struggle against racial segregation in Montgomery, Alabama, I came to see at a very early stage that a synthesis of Gandhi's method of nonviolence and the Christian ethic of love is the best weapon available to Negroes for this struggle for freedom and human dignity. It may well be that the Gandhian approach will bring about a solution to the race problem in America. His spirit is a continual reminder to oppressed people that it is possible to resist evil and yet not resort to violence. The Gandhian influence in some way still speaks to the conscience of the world as nations grapple with international problems. If we fail on an international scale to follow the Gandhian principle of nonviolence, we may end up by destroying ourselves through the misuse of our own instruments. The choice is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It is now either nonviolence or non-existence. Oppressed people can deal with oppression in three ways. They can accept or acquiesce. Under segregation, they can adjust to it. Yet, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. The minute one accepts segregation, one cooperates with it. Oppressed people can, on the other hand, resort to physical violence, a method both whole nations and oppressed peoples have used. But violence merely brings about a temporary victory and not permanent peace. It creates ever new problems. Gandhi has come on the scene of history with still another way. He would resist evil as much as the man who uses violence, but he resists it without external violence or violence of the spirit. That is what Gandhism does. It is a method of the strong. If the only alternative is between cowardice and violence, it is better, as Gandhi said, to use violence, but there is another way. I myself gained this insight from Gandhi. When I was in theological school, I thought the only way we could solve our problem of segregation was an armed revolt. I felt that the Christian ethic of love was confined to individual relationships. I could not see how it could work in social conflict. Then I read Gandhi's ethic of love as revealed in Jesus, but raised to a social strategy for transformation. This lifts love from individual relationships to the place of social transformation. This Gandhi helped us to understand, and for this we are grateful a decade after his death. And now, after listening to this early statement, 1958, we can understand why Dr. King has been called the American Gandhi for his leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association in its successful campaign against bus segregation using nonviolent methods, which was 1955, 56, one long year. So the next step, you can read it as a chapter in Gandhi's first autobiography, Freedom, Stride Towards Freedom. You know, this Stride Towards Freedom is a book published in 1958. And in September 1, 1958, you can read following in this book. It was King referring to his moment of enlightenment, referring to Gandhi, as early as 1950, during a Philadelphia meeting of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And King wrote, then one Saturday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. He was there to preach for the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke of the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and bought a half-dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. Like most people, I had heard of Gandhi, but I had never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by the Salt March to the Sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of Satyagraha, Satya is truth, which equals love, and Agraha is force. Satyagraha, therefore, means truth force or love force. The whole concept of Satyagraha was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. Prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationship. The turn the other cheek philosophy and the love your enemies philosophy were only valid, I felt, when individuals were in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations were in conflict, a more realistic approach seemed necessary. But after reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation. It was in this Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence that I discovered the method for social reform that I had been seeking for so many months. The intellectual and moral satisfaction that I failed to gain from the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill, the revolutionary methods of Marx and Lenin, the social contract theory of Hobbes, the back-to-nature optimism of Rousseau, the Superman philosophy of Nietzsche, I found in the nonviolent resistance philosophy of Gandhi. I came to feel that this was the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in the struggle for freedom. Now, King published this book in 1958, and he signed his books, like many authors do. And Isla Curry was an African-American woman who attempted to assassinate the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. She stabbed King with a letter opener at a Harlem book signing on September 20, 1958, during the Harlem civil rights movement of the late 1950s and early 60s. King survived Curry's attempt. King went on a tour to promote his book, Stride Toward Freedom, soon after it was published. And during a book signing at Bloomstein's department store in Harlem on September 20, 1958, Curry approached and asked him if he was Martin Luther King Jr. When King replied in the affirmative, Curry stabbed him in the chest with a steel letter opener. Now, Audrey de Lambert Maynard was an American doctor and surgeon who is most notable for operating on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to save his life after this assassination attempt. Maynard was born in Georgetown, Guyana, and migrated to the United States in 1906. He lived in Lower Manhattan, and he wrote the book Surgeons to the Poor, the Harlem Hospital story. You know, after this assassination, police officers took King in the chair down to an ambulance that took King to Harlem Hospital. And there was a top of trauma surgeons. Chief of surgery, Operator Lambert Maynard, entered and attempted to remove the letter opener from King's chest, but cut his glove on the blade. A surgical clamp was used to remove it. Cordis was one of them who was called in to operate. That was John W.V. Cordis, the lifesaver. He made incisions, inserted a rib spreader, making King's aorta visible. And Cordis successfully saved Dr. King. He was the subject of the book When Harlem Nearly Killed King, the 1958 stabbing of Dr. Martin Luther King by Hugh Pearson. And then to come to a conclusion, listen to King's own reminiscence. What happened after his assassination? You know, and you guess afterwards when he said this, you know, several years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a demented Black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down, writing, and said, "Yes." And the next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to a Harlem hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon, and that blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in. And from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I'd received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." And she said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze." And I want to say tonight that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze. Because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960. By the way, this is my birth year. I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961, when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation in interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962 when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963, when the Black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I'd sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama, to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And he ends this last public address in Memphis, Tennessee, 3rd of April, 1968, one day before his assassination, when he mentions there are storm warnings and said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I have looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And in this last paragraph, he identified with Prophet Moses, who, you know, was instrumental in bringing about the Decalogue. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not kill. And it was the man of the Exodus to the desert to escape bondage, to emancipate from slavery. So I just want to thank you for your attention and tell you that I prepared a second part, which gives a broad overview to Gandhi's, Mahatma Gandhi's references to the African-American civil rights movement, right, starting from 1903, when he wrote an article about Booker, Washington, and then proceeding to W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, and then proceeding to Howard Thurman and to Benjamin Mays and then Mordechai Johnson, we already mentioned, because Mordechai Johnson's lecture was the revealing moment for Dr. King in 1950 in Philadelphia. To understand Gandhi. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Christian. Very, very deep and very, very insightful. I would request respected participant to kindly put your question in the chat box. Meanwhile, I would like to invite Professor Douglas to kindly share his view.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, so you can hear me. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Ananta and Randhir. I did not know about this wonderful webinar symposium until I received an email, just 2-3 days ago, inviting me to join. And then yesterday afternoon, I received an email from Ananta asking me if I could speak about Gandhi, King, Buber, and Levinas. So I apologize for last minute, but I did make an effort to include all 4 of them, and especially to address the major terms that you used for your symposium. Let me just say very briefly in a personal introductory way, 30 January is very meaningful for me. I first experienced it during my youthful year in Benares, at Benares Hindu University in 30 January 1964. And so that has always been a very meaningful holiday with Gandhi-informed messages that for me are more true today and more significant than ever. Gandhi's presence I first experienced during 1963, 1964 in India, where in many ways Gandhi's presence was ubiquitous, more than it is in India today. And Gandhi informed many of my personal values, my involvement for years in the civil rights movement in the South, and then the anti-war movements. And it was only, but in a practical way in terms of activism. And it was only in the 1990s that I realized that I could approach Gandhi as a scholar, as offering a profound philosophy. In terms of Martin Luther King Jr., of course, in my years in the South, King was the most important presence, nonviolent activist presence. And of course, I became familiar through King's stride towards freedom, pilgrimage to nonviolence that was just mentioned, how King, you cannot understand King without understanding the formative influence of Gandhi on him, his philosophy and his practices. I might say for Martin Buber, I was very fortunate on my return from India in 1964. I actually had the opportunity to meet with Buber in Jerusalem. And he only lived for one more year. It was very late in his life. I was a great admirer of Buber and I and Thou and other works. And also, I was deeply influenced, as Ori had mentioned, I was surprised, by Buber's, who greatly admired Gandhi, but his critique of Gandhi's advice to the Jews in Germany and to Hitler in the late 1930s, and then Buber's response. And unlike many Gandhians, I actually agree more with Buber's response and critique of Gandhi. And this has helped shape deepening my selectively and reformulated and reapplied approach to Gandhi as rendering Gandhi more relevant to the crises we face today. Finally, let me just say Levinas. I've always admired, my disciplinary background is philosophy, including phenomenology, and I greatly admired Levinas is a great scholar of Judaism, something Gandhi had limited understanding of. He also is a major scholar emphasizing ethics in a way that, of course, is shared by Gandhi as a great ethicist, and also presents a profound phenomenological insights. So I've tried to focus on some of the main terms that you have for the webinar symposium, raise some issues. Martyrdom, right? Buber and Levinas are not martyrs. Gandhi and King are rightfully regarded as martyrs. Gandhi was martyred on 30 January 1948, and King was martyred on the 4th of April 1968. King lived exactly half the life that Gandhi had. And martyrdom is central to understanding their messages and legacy on 30 January and for the future of humankind and the planet. I'll just mention 3 qualifications about martyrdom for challenging reflections. First, martyrdom does not necessarily lead to a legacy of nonviolence. Often we find the opposite today. Second, martyrdom often leads to anti-Gandhi and anti-King views of liberation from this sinful and evil world of suffering. And third, martyrs are often idealized, worshipped, even deified as too good for this world, rendering them as largely irrelevant in addressing our planetary future. In my experiences and understanding, this is how the martyrs King and Gandhi are often celebrated. So, emancipation. another key term in the title. Clearly, Gandhi and King, but also Buber and Levinas, are concerned with worldly emancipation. I'll share one common view of emancipation that, in my view, often leads to oversimplified, stereotypical, essentialized, and absolutized interpretations central to our webinar symposium. It is certainly true that we have thousands of years of philosophical, religious, mystical, and spiritual views of emancipation that emphasize asceticism, renunciation, world transcending liberation from our unenlightened, ignorant, illusory, sinful, and evil world of suffering and worldly bondage. That is not Gandhi's approach to emancipation. There are passages in Gandhi's writings in which he upholds his faith in final, perfect, unconditioned, absolute moksha, liberation from the relative, finite, imperfect, karmic cycles of worldly oppression, injustice, and suffering. But this is not the most significant approach by Gandhi in addressing worldly emancipation and our planetary future. Gandhi's major focus is on our situated, contextualized, imperfect, historical, economic, political, ethical, cultural, religious, educational, environmental, violent and nonviolent, untruthful and truthful, structures and relations. His major emancipatory project, integrally interrelated and unified from the personal to the worldly levels, involves increasing emancipatory awareness, self-purification, selfless service, action-oriented resistance, and transformation to the open-ended realization of greater truth, nonviolence, and other ways of living closer to, but not perfectly realizing, the absolute ideals. In this regard, Gandhi is influenced, but also offers a radical critique of most traditional Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and other Indian, Asian, and Western perspectives on emancipation. One can make similar observations about how Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to freedom, liberation, emancipation, and constructive planetary futures is often oversimplified and misinterpreted. King certainly has writings, sermons, and speeches expressing his faith in a transcendent, eternal, monotheistic God, in salvation, and in perfect, infinite, absolute reality. However, his major focus is in addressing oppression, dehumanization, injustice, racism, and domination in this world, and struggling for contextualized change. For example, that is why King is critical of many Black ministers who preach individual otherworldly salvation and liberation in their exclusive focus on the next heavenly world as providing hope and comfort, but not resisting and transforming suffering and oppression in this world. Buber and Levinas are focused on our unenlightened human existential situatedness in this world, and not on world transcending otherworldly enlightenment, freedom, and liberation. This is true of Levinas's phenomenological analysis, with its focus on the experiences and expressions of unenlightened human beings as they are contextually situated, and understanding the dynamic structures allowing for more conscious, ethical, authentic, emancipatory realization. This is even true of Buber's famous I-thou relational dynamic, with the inadequate human experience of the infinite thou and how it is dialectically related to the finite thou and self-other development. With regard to the symposium's focus on world emancipation and alternative planetary futures, Gandhi, King, Buber, and Levinas all agree, often in their different but complementary approaches, that we now need a radical qualitative paradigm shift. What is the dominant paradigm with its values, presuppositions, theories, practices, and narratives from which we desperately need such a paradigm shift? I would submit that Gandhi, King, Buber, and Levinas all offer complex, nuanced, dynamic, open-ended, experiential, and experimental, holistic, organic approaches and interpretations, emphasizing the structural and relational interconnectedness of all of life. What unites us is more fundamental and essential than what divides us. But this is a unity with a respect for perspectival differences. Our interconnectedness and unity are experienced and expressed ethically, economically, politically, socially, culturally, environmentally, spiritually, and ontologically. Such a paradigm shift based on this perspectival awareness and development is now essential for our emancipation and planetary futures, for human and planetary survival, sustainability, and flourishing. The dominant paradigms and narratives with regard to emancipation and planetary futures assume, theorize, practice, and use economic, political, coercive, ideological, and other force to uphold and perpetuate the very opposite. They privilege differences in which what divides and separates us is more fundamental and essential than what unites us. In such narratives, with their worldviews and constructions of our true identities, we may privilege and essentialize ourselves as separate, ego-defined individuals with our ego-defined desires and attachments for wealth, possessions, maximizing consumption, power, status, control, and domination of others and of nature. We may privilege and essentialize ourselves in terms of dominant class relations of exploitation and inequality, superior caste, race, gender, ethnic relations, xenophobic and chauvinistic nation-state exceptionalism and superiority, and more. Such a dominant modern paradigm usually accepts a means-ends analysis of instrumental rationality, in which individuals, social groups, states, militaries, or others privileged subjects calculate what means, including unethical and violent and untruthful means, are most advantageous in achieving their ends, whether of corporate control and exploitation, maximizing wealth and power, winning elections and wars, and more. In their critiques and alternatives to this dominant paradigm, Gandhi offers the most extensive and developed analysis of means-ends relations, the violence, untruth, dehumanization, and immorality of, quote, modern civilization. King's views on this, often influenced by Gandhi, are also very developed. For example, in his Breaking the Silence sermon, exactly 1 year before his assassination, and in which he came out forcefully against the Vietnam War, King profoundly focuses on the interconnected triplets of racism, militarism, violence, and materialism, with its dominant consumerism, in which the others are reduced to thing-defined objects of use. Buber offers us profound symmetrical, reciprocal I-thou analysis in challenging the dominant modern post-Cartesian capitalist paradigm, privileging of the self over the other, who is othered as non-self other, and then easily marginalized, objectified, dehumanized, treated violently, and often destroyed as less human, immoral, evil, and threatening other. Buber presents an alternative emancipatory and planetary existential, reciprocal, harmonious, interconnected perspective in which I am not I without embracing my social, ethical, human, symmetrical relations with the privileged other. Levinas also offers a radical critique of and an alternative to the dominant modern paradigm. Unlike Buber, Levinas offers an asymmetrical structural analysis, reversing the privileging of the subject self. This does not develop from some philosophical argument, but is dramatically based on the existential phenomenological encounter with the other. In my encounter with the face of the other, the presence of the other makes an existential and ethical demand on me. I must privilege the needs of the other, not in the sense of usual self-sacrifice, altruism, or charity, privileging the perspectival situatedness and needs of the other, embracing the other as essential to my self-identity, is central to the open-ended existential phenomenological dynamic through which I develop and realize the deeper self and reality. With time, I could easily relate that to Gandhi. I think very similar. Gandhi's famous talisman, Gandhi's the need to reduce the ego self to zero, to a cipher, serving the needs of privileging the needs of the other in terms of Swaraj, both the economic, bodily needs, but also the deeper philosophical, spiritual need for freedom, emancipation, and liberation of the other, integral to self-purification and world emancipation, and the future of the planet. So I'll just end by saying, suggesting that all four contribute to our understanding of how we live in a time of extreme crises in which we have the technology and other means to destroy life on this planet. Gandhi, King, Buber, and Levinas are catalysts, challenging us to rethink and change our dominant, immoral, violent, and untruthful paradigms, and to transform our presuppositions, thoughts and feelings and imaginations, theories and practices into revolutionary, transformative perspectives and actions that will bring about world emancipation, a hopeful, sustainable future, and human and planetary flourishing. So I thank you for allowing me this time and for your attentiveness, and I look forward to any feedback.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Douglas, for an excellent deliberation. And definitely we'd like to have more engagement in future also. So dear and respected friend, now it's time to invite our discussants. So in the series, first I would like to invite Professor Julius Ribuke, and then Professor Asa Mukherjee, and then Professor Gyan Golui. Yes, Julius.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen to all the three lectures, and I think this is a beginning of a discussion, because what the first speaker said was very interesting, but also controversial. You can discuss how did Buber see that, and why has this been, and Christian Bartolf had written this nice book about the Buber-Gandhi controversy. And so I think you should think of a continuation of this discussion, which is very insightful, and thank you all the participants. Thank you.
So, thank you, dear friends. Randhir, today has been a bit of challenging time. My internet and phone difficulty. So, thank you, Professor Allen and Christian. So now let us take it forward. If my internet fails, and Randhir, we take it forward.
Okay.
So we had a request from Gyan Luigi. He wanted to share a little bit of thought. So let us invite Gyan Luigi.
Yes. Am I audible? Thank you.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, it was really all very interesting. I take some notices, and I would like to say something about the question of Antigones, because, well, this is an example how to how in the way in which a person who generally is going against power and is going also against the law, the written laws, runs the risk to be destroyed. That is, Antigone also sacrifices her own life. But in general, we can see that if a person is going to contrast and also to win against the unjust laws, this person lives, unfortunately, under a constant danger. And unfortunately, we can see this person run the risk of being killed. And this is the example of Gandhi, of course, and of Martin Luther King. That is, I think that the question of the position between the person who is going with her new ideas and her new ideals, which are contrasting the state of things, the unjust state of things, I think that this person can win, but of course the tragedy connected to this situation is that many times this person, after winning, is going unfortunately to be destroyed. And this is a question of course, perhaps which perhaps is related to a certain dark aspect of history and of the meditation of the philosophy of history, of course. And well, this is a ground of meditation. The second thing that I would like to say is, I think that of the 60s, 50s and 60s, there are very many theological movements in different beliefs, not only the Christian beliefs, of course, but for instance, in the Christian beliefs, there is the example of the theology of hope, for instance, which is which had its origin in Germany, for instance, with Moltmann, but which had very many contacts abroad, not only, of course, in Germany, but within Germany, but for instance, in the United States. Moltmann taught, I think, 3 or 4 years in different universities of the United States, and the theology of hope, in the sense of hope, not hope directed to the otherworldly environment, but in as much as directed again towards the promise and the fulfillment of God's promise, the theology of hope has an orientation also on the earth. This was rather revolutionary for the theology of the 50s and the 60s. Now we can say, no, it is, of course, normal, but at that time it was not normal at all. It is, hope was directed principally and mainly in the theological debate to the other world, and the dimension of this world was only a preparation to the other world. Hope was not, so to speak, an active ground and foundation for also a political program of modification of this world. And this was the breakpoint represented in Germany by Moltmann and by all those who follow the new theory of the theology of hope, and of course also in the United States. It is the theology of hope is in Germany means Moltmann, but of course theology of hope is a worldly dimension, is a world dimension in theology. In Christian theology, of course, but not only in Christian theology. That is, it is connected to a general reinterpretation of hope. These are the two things which I would like to outline, but of course it was wonderful that, of course, all that was said would need hours and hours of meditation, of discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gyangului, as always. Very insightful comment. And I would request honorable speakers to kindly note down these questions, and I would like to invite you at the end. So now I would like to invite Professor Asa Mukherjee, Madam, and then I can see also Professor John Clemmer and Sudha Reddy. So I will invite you next. So.
Yeah, I'm really delighted to be present here, and it was such a wonderful interaction. I could, sort of experience, and I wish we had more time for the speakers to elaborate on different points, which but as it happens in most of the this kind of dialogue, you have very short time, and then the speakers are so rich in their content that like a lot of things people, especially audience, who are not so expert like me, I mean, like we miss and we really seek clarifications. So I have really enjoyed this wonderful dialogue. And as it was said, that it's a journey in thought and also in action, perhaps. So yeah, I mean, I would like to thank each and every speaker from the audience, actually. But then I perhaps can point out some of my queries, I can sort of raise them, especially into Dr. Christian's presentation. It was so wonderful. And then he talked about the concept of love, which is Christian love, and how Gandhi has used that concept of love in Satyagraha. And he actually argued that how love lifts individual from individual to the society, or from individual to the social. Now, this is very important for Gandhi as well as for King. Now, since I have more exposure to Gandhian concept, I would raise from Gandhian perspective that, although it's true that, this the individual love actually transforms from individual to the social. But see, in the context of independence of India, things were different. But now that, this kind of objective is not there, this non-violent approach to the social lifting is almost losing its ground. And love to the other, actually, the second speaker, when he was talking about the other speaker, I think it was Professor Douglas, who was talking about Levinas, the concept of other. For social context, you have to have the other. But in Gandhi context, the other is actually the extension of the individual. So this concept of other in Levinas and the concept of other in Gandhi, they're very different. The other is, for Gandhi, is not the other. It is the extension of, because basically he's working within the Vaishnava tradition and Advaita tradition, Advaita philosophy system, as you know, in that tradition. And therefore, the other is not really the other. It is the extension of, it's, I shouldn't say extension, actually, it's the same as, the other is same as individual. And therefore, Atma is not really, Atma and Paramatma, they are one. So this is the Advaitic system in which Gandhi is talking about. And therefore, it's much easier in the Indian context to understand this thing. But then in the Western context, this Christian love, which I feel is more individualistic rather than social, and how Martin Luther King is using this. My impression is perhaps that's different, and I would like to have a comment from both, actually, from Dr. Christian and also from Dr. Douglas. So this is, I suppose, which I thought that I should raise the issue and seek some clarification. The other thing is regarding the transformation, the concept of transformation. The concept of transformation, which is also related with the first issue I have raised, because, to be able to connect with the other, one need to transform. Actually, I wouldn't use the word transformation. I would perhaps use the transcendence. The individual has to transcend one's limitations to connect with the other. So it is more transcendence rather than transformation. So what exactly is the concept of transformation here, especially in the context of Gandhi and also in Martin Luther King? Because my impression is that they might be using the same words, but the meaning is very different and the context is also different. And perhaps we need to look at it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Azam Mukherjee, madam. Very, very deep question. So now I would like to invite Professor John Clemmer, sir.
Well, thank you. But I don't want to encroach on the time of, I know that a lot of people have questions specifically for the speakers. I very much want to thank the speakers. And I'd like to say that one of the things I think that's emerged, and I'll just comment on this briefly, was the first time I met Professor Ori, the only time I'd met him previously, was in fact in the context of this very series of webinars, when the subject was in fact Buber and Levinas. And I think a very creative outcome of tonight's discussion has been this quadrilateral relationship that's been emphasized between Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Levinas, and Buber. And I think to put those together and to begin to see the creative thinking that comes out of the dynamism created by this is a very, very useful thought. So we don't have time to discuss that, but I simply throw that out as a comment. I think that's been a very useful product of this seminar tonight. So again, thank you, speakers. There's so many specific issues you raised, but I'd rather leave this to the other participants who've really put questions in the chat box. So thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Sudha Reddy. Yes, Professor Saji.
Professor Randhir, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful learning experience for me. There's no question as such. Thank you.
So I can see in the chat box Professor next. I cannot see any question in the chat box. So Dr. Tiwari, if you have any question, please ask.
Sir, it was a great learning. As of now, I don't have any question, but it was really a great session, and thanks to you and Giri sir for bringing
Thank
such
you.
a brilliant speakers on this platform, where we got so many new ideas, and particularly Bartolf sir for citing that very heart-touching statement of King Martin Luther Jr. His last means his speech in form of giving the reply to the girl of 9th standard. If I would have sneezed, I would have died. But thanks, I didn't sneeze, and I achieved so many things. I gave so many things to the America and the society. So really, it was very relevant. And thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. And I can see one question in the chat box asked by Sanjana Sharma. How to live the Gandhian way in the present world, a world which is largely based on desire. So this is a very interesting question. So Dr. Christian, would you like to respond all this concern first?
Yes, I think we can also take a lesson of Dr. King after he was assassinated, and the way how he gave a public statement immediately after his assassination. So, and this might be a model for us today in present times. So first of all, let me say that I feel no ill will towards the assassin, and know that thoughtful people will do all in their power to see that she gets the help she apparently needs if she is to become a free and constructive member of society. I also wish to express my heartfelt appreciation to the thousands of people of all faiths and races in all walks of life who have indicated by telegrams, letters, calls, cards, flowers, and other gifts their warm concern for my well-being. These messages were a great source of strength and support because I know they were a token of respect for the cause we all cherish, freedom and equality for all men. The pathetic aspect of this experience is not the injury to one individual. It demonstrates that a climate of hatred and bitterness so permeates areas of our nation that inevitably deeds of extreme violence must erupt. Today it is I. Tomorrow it could be another leader or any man, woman, or child who will be the victim of lawlessness and brutality. I hope that this experience proves to be socially constructive by demonstrating the urgent necessity for non-violence to govern the affairs of man. Through these days, I have been increasingly able to understand more deeply the hard blows and tragic suffering so many of my people and other members of minority groups experience all too often and without cause or reason. The experience of these last few days has deepened my faith in the relevance of the spirit of nonviolence, if necessary social change is peacefully to take place. Through experience, I've now come to see more clearly the redemptive power of nonviolence. I have been brought to see its wider social significance. I am now convinced that if the Negro holds fast to the spirit of nonviolence, our struggle, for example, will challenge and help redeem not only America, but the world. Finally, although my thoughts have never left the freedom struggle, I am intensely impatient to rejoin my friends and colleagues to continue the work that we all know must be done regardless of the cost. Thus speaks the martyr, alive. So, you know, it's really so. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deserves a United Nations International Day dedicated to mutual aid and solidarity. On his birthday, 15th of January, that is what we wrote to this president last year, 1 year ago. But I want to refer to the questions. One is, let's remember Gandhi's reference to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and also the influence on Martin Luther King by Walter Rauschenbusch. So these theologians are not mentioned in this context, but you should in future dedicate an event like this to those eminent inspirations for Dr. Martin Luther King, and also the dialogue of Gandhi and Bonhoeffer. Then I would like to remember that it's indeed the two notions of martyr and emancipation. And you know that martyr means actually from the Greek, witness. So it is a witness of truth, a witness of justice that suffers, someone that suffers persecution and death because he is openly outspoken. This is one. So that is why we can expand the notion of martyrdom by understanding the original meaning, Greek language meaning, as a witness. We are all witnesses, by the way. And bigotry and hatred, as we know, since Rabbi Prince mentioned this on the March of Washington 1963, are not the most evil, but silence of the witnesses. This is one thing. And then emancipation, this is the last. Emancipation, you know, actually it comes from the act of liberating someone from authority. E manu capere, capture from someone else's hand, means to become free, the emancipation. And I learned this meaning from the Latin, e manu capere, from this word emancipation. Can you imagine where? In the essay of Marcel Mauss about the gift. And he, polyglot Marcel Mauss from the Durkheim school, was emancipating science from the religious authorities with his work about sacrifice, about gift, about magic. So Marcel Mauss, the sociologist, shall not be forgotten. All the scientists should go back to these pioneering work to emancipate social sciences, sociology from the authorities of the religious dogmas. And that was the turn of the century, around 1900. It was the same time when Gandhi started his Satyagraha struggle, you know, influenced by Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee Institute, John Langalibalele Dube, and his wife Nokotela, with the Olange Institute, by the international printing press, liberal atmosphere, free speech, to act against the colonialists who were, as Gandhi knew, even prepared to commit crimes against humanity, massacres, commit genocide, German, French, English, wars. They were the first experiences as a stretcher bearer of Gandhi, as someone who witnessed the atrocity. He was a witness of the colonialist crimes, the imperialist crimes. It was the time of the German genocide in Southwest Africa. Don't forget this, about the two Boer wars, the so-called Zulu rebellion, which was Bambata revolt. And all this was the time of Tolstoy. Tolstoy, who read Thoreau and understood him. Tolstoy, who built upon non-cooperation, about non-resistance, William Lloyd Garrison, Declaration of Sentiments, who referred to him extensively in his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, which was the key inspiration for the student Mahatma Gandhi in London, which he referred to in his autobiography. So we see Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience, Leo Tolstoy, Nonviolent Non-Cooperation, Mahatma Gandhi, Satyagraha, Savodaya, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who referred to agape, another concept of love, which is even transcending caritas, charity. Love, which is a dynamic force. So he called himself an extremist of love. This is the nonviolent revolutionary. And then, as we know, he opposed the Vietnam War, and he organized a march for the poor people, all the poor people on Washington, 1968, and he was killed by another pawn in their game, only a pawn in their game. That was the song by Bob Dylan on the March on Washington, referring to Medgar Evers. That's why I proposed to play a song in the end on Medgar Evers. Too many martyrs, too many deaths, too many lies and empty words were said. Phil Oakes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, Professor Douglas, you are invited to respond our discussions, queries. Please unmute yourself, sir.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are.
Yes. Yeah,
unmuted.
thank you. I don't know, Randhir, let me just ask you, is there any time left?
Yes,
Or-
sir. Yes, sir. You have 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah,
5 to
okay.
10
I
minutes.
thought I would just check. So I'll try to just address a little bit some of the questions. If we had time, I could provide dialogue and responses to all of the very good questions. There are a lot of comments about the theology of hope and Moltmann and the influence that had, including many of the people like Eric Fromm and others who came to the United States and promoted that. And Martin Luther King Jr. has some very profound analysis of the need for hope in his opposition to some of the Black Power movement and Black consciousness movement and other developments that he felt were often courageous, but without the important dimension of hope, they simply degenerated into futile actions and violence and a kind of martyrdom that he did not want to uphold. I thought the questions about the other and contrasting Gandhi and Levinas were very interesting and insightful. And actually that, if there was time, that's where I would love to engage in dialogue and introduce, in fact, my very different understanding of much of Gandhi and Levinas on the relationship between the individual, the social, and the other. What I'll comment on relating just two other questions asked. One was the general question about how do you live the Gandhian way? Okay, and then I can relate that to a correct observation that was made about what's happening in India today. There is no simple way of addressing the Gandhian way. Gandhi himself struggled with his way. And if someone so remarkable of Gandhi struggled till right at the end of his life, why should it be easy for us? On the other hand, Gandhi says, once you understand the basic values, presuppositions, concepts, action-oriented practices, then in some ways it's easy. How you put it into practice often is difficult, but in the way, the Gandhian way, is in some ways easy. So let me simply emphasize that for Gandhi, of course, all of the values and concepts and practices are interrelated. But Gandhi most often says in his way that his major focus is on two concepts, two principles of satya or truth and ahimsa or nonviolence. And then, so one would have to develop an awareness and practices around truth and nonviolence. And then that would be integrated with all the other major concepts that Gandhi has, whether it's Swaraj, Sarvodaya, the Satyagraha, all of the principles of the constructive work, right? And so forth. So what is important to understand is how Gandhi, for me, challenges us to really broaden and deepen our understanding of truth and nonviolence and all of the major values and concepts. And because he is best known for nonviolence, right, as we all know, let me mention that in the Gandhian way, which I think has to be integrated with other ways, complementary ways, nonviolence is broadened and deepened. Gandhi challenge. It's not only overt physical violence, like we talked about today, assassinations or terrorism, or what the Nazis were doing, genocide towards Jews and so forth. In fact, nonviolence is multidimensional, right? In addition to overt physical violence, if we want to develop the Gandhian way, We have to understand inner violence. Hate is violence, right? Psychological violence. We have to understand economic violence, which involves exploitation, poverty, the way those who are privileged, class privileged, who control the means of production, the resources of society, are able to establish economic relations of domination with the have-nots. We have to understand political violence, cultural violence, religious violence, educational violence, environmental violence, all these different dimensions of violence, how we're socialized, and how they all become, they mutually reinforce each other on conscious, but also unconscious, emotional, pre-reflective, hidden dimensions, so that finally we are socialized so that we accept violent views of ourselves, our relations to others, our relations to nature. And the Gandhian way is how we have to become aware of and disrupt the vicious chains of violence, of multidimensional violence, to begin to substitute dimensions of love, of kindness, of compassion, right? And all the other Gandhian values that then will create more life-sustaining, authentic, relate causal conditions and structural relations in our own life, in our own world. The other dimension to me that's important, the way I have interpreted in broadening and deepening, is Gandhi talks about the structural violence of the status quo. That's business as usual. That's for Gandhi, the dominant economic system in India, the United States, and the world is structurally violent. The dominant political system is structurally violent. The dominant institutional, cultural, and religious structural systems are violent. The dominant gender systems, right? Caste systems, racial systems, ethnic systems, national systems are structurally violent. So again, once one becomes conscious of that, it opens up, it bursts open our Gandhian way of how to understand, for example, how to live nonviolently. And that is very difficult. Gandhi himself says, not in some absolute idealized way, but in terms of real contextualized, situated living, Gandhi says we all are violent, even those who uphold the values of ahimsa, simply by our existential mode of being in the world, we are violent. We harm others, nature, even in practicing hygiene, in fact, clearing roads for housing, for habitation, for agriculture, and so on. We necessarily commit violence. And Gandhi, more than that, Gandhi admits that sometimes he miscalculates. Gandhi miscalculates. He even commits what he calls Himalayan blunders, where he had the best of intention. And then through those experiences, experiments with truth and nonviolence, he sees that they were failed experiments and he has to relearn, as do we. So I'll just connect that with one other thing because of time. But I think once one accepts some of those major Gandhian principles, presuppositions, values, priorities, right? Worldview, perspectives, then in fact it changes everything. It brings about a radical qualitative transformation in how you at least can attempt to live your life in very meaningful ways. The one other thing I'd relate that to, there was that excellent question raised about the lack of nonviolence, of nonviolent social uplift in India today. how this has changed. And in fact, major focus on Gandhi's Sarvodaya, right? The well-being of all, the uplift of all, especially those who are the most disadvantaged, the most oppressed, suffering the most, have the least freedom, and so forth. Okay. And in terms of the dominant narrative in India today, that is lacking. The one challenge that I would raise, just people that I've been engaged with, happens all over the world, but in India today, I would say that there are very powerful dominant economic forces in India, corporate, the billionaires, the millionaires, those who run the big corporations, the big medical professions, the big control of resources, agriculture, industry, control of media, as well as the dominant political forces and religious forces and so forth. I would say use Gandhi, right? For most, Gandhi's irrelevant. They know little about Gandhi and he's not part of their worldview. But I find increasingly there's an attempt to appropriate Gandhi on his birthday and other occasions, the same way Ambedkar and others are being used, using Gandhi for very anti-Gandhian, divisive, violent, untruthful purposes. And so again, I think in the Gandhian way, we have to be aware of what's going on, how Gandhi is really misused to deflect attention from the priorities and values and principles of a Gandhian way, and how he is used to deflect attention or even ideologically to exploit and anti-Gandhian, not just non-Gandhian, but anti-Gandhian values and principles in prisons, in universities, and throughout the society. So it's a challenge I'll leave you with.
Thank you so much, sir. So enriching and very insightful session. Thank you so much, all of you. Now it's time to offer vote of thanks. So I would like to invite Dr. Devendra Kumar Tiwari sir to kindly offer vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for inviting me to extend the vote of thanks. And really, the words are limited to express a thanks on such an occasion and such a brilliant speakers. So formally, on behalf of Raffles University, Swadhyaya Satyagraha for Co-Learning and Raise Global Foundation, I wish to extend this vote of thanks to one and all from bottom of my heart. And to begin formally, I would like to extend my grateful gratitude to Professor Orono Soltes for initiating such great journey of pondering over the life and ideologies of two great thinker and philosophers of world, King Martin Luther Jr. and M.K. Gandhi. So thank you, Professor Orono Soltes. Next, I would like to express my deep felt gratitude for sailing this boat of learning together in such a smooth way and highlighting the philosophy of Martin Buber, King Martin Luther Jr. and Gandhi. It was great learning, sir. So thank you so much for being here and making us updated with so many new things. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to express my deep felt gratitude to Dr. Douglas Allen sir. Really, it was first time I was listening to your good self, but it was great learning. The way you presented your ideas and the way you responded the questions. Really, hats off to you, sir. Thank you so much. I would like to express my deep felt gratitude to Professor Anand Giri sir for moderating the session and enriching us with your great experience about the philosophy of King Martin Luther Jr. and Gandhi. So tons of thanks to Professor Anand Giri. I would like to express my deep gratitude to our honorable discussants, Professor Julius, Dr. Gyan Louis Gee, Professor Asha Mukherjee ma'am, and particularly I would like to say special thanks to Professor Asha Mukherjee ma'am for raising the issue of self and others and giving two different concepts of two different opinions about Gandhi's opinion about self and other individuals and others, and that Buber's opinion about self. My deep gratitude to Dr. John Clemmer, Professor Saji, Dr. Gyanluigi once again, and everybody, Minati Pradhanji, and every participant from all over the world for making this event great success. Finally, last but not the least, entire credit goes to Professor Randhir Gautam for planning and executing everything in such a great way. So tons of thanks to Professor Randhir sir. Thank you so much. My
Thank you so much.
namaste, pranam, and good
Thank you.
night to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as Dr. Christian Bartolf told that we are going to say goodbye with a beautiful song. So definitely, as Martin Luther said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And both these thinkers, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, invoke the idea of hope that is very, very important for this civilization to live. So I'm sharing the screen. So thank you so much. Goodbye. Take care. Have a nice day.